So I wanted to do a little video talking about the cranial nerves, which I think is probably one of the most famous topics in terms of mnemonics, at least, these kind of letter mnemonics. And this is an A&P textbook here, and this is an example of a couple of mnemonics. So I've heard this one before. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. I've heard one about Voldemort and Horcruxes. This one I think is interesting because the first three words are the same. O. All right. I mean, sure, that's going to help you remember that the first three are starting with O, but it's not necessarily telling you what these O's stand for, nor is it really telling you the function of any of these. It's giving you the letter direction, which can be a good way to encode, the rest of this. But, you're also wasting brain storage on words, green vegetables that you really don't need to know. And if you forget any part of this mnemonic or mix something up, the whole thing kind of breaks. So I've been doing a lot of research on the memory palace or the method of loci or the Roman room concept. And I figured, let me see if I can apply this concept of the cranial nerves and kind of marry it with the Roman room with the memory palace. And I figured, let me choose a location that maybe a lot of students are familiar with. So if you know the show The Office, and you've seen The Office, then you're familiar with Dunder Mifflin and the office layout. So I figured, is there a way to overlay the 12 cranial nerves into the office layout of Dunder Mifflin? Okay. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of the memory palace, the idea is you place or encode information in physical spatial locations that you're familiar with. The idea here is that, and a very common thing to use would be your house, because you're already familiar with the layout of your house. That's already in your brain, and more importantly, it's already in the long-term storage and memory of your brain. So to be able to borrow that space and place what you're learning next to neurons that already exist is incredibly and immensely powerful. And it seems really silly, and the first time I heard about the memory palace, I disregarded it immediately. But I was able to use it for a couple of different things, and I just realized the immense power of this. So I'm going to walk you through. I did create a memory palace using not only locations in Dunder Mifflin, but characters as well. And I overlaid the 12 cranial nerves into this. So I'm going to walk you through how I did this. Okay. All right. So when you walk in to Dunder Mifflin, the very first thing you see is obviously reception, where Pam sits. Okay. The first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, and it has to do with smell. All right. If you know your medical terminology and know the term olfactory, you'll know that that has to do with smell. And I also like to picture olfactory like an old factory. So I've put a picture of an old factory. And the little story here is that Pam got some cookies from an old factory. All right. Obviously, cookies have a great aroma. So maybe Jim is smelling these. Anybody that's around here, you yourself, as you're walking in through Dunder Mifflin, are smelling these cookies. So you have olfactory. Now, there's kind of a secondary mnemonic at play here because all of the cranial nerves are either sensory, motor, or both, mixed sensory and motor. Okay, so I'm going to try to overlay that as well. But I think more importantly, once you understand what the cranial nerve does, you should inherently know, is it sensory, is it motor, or is it mixed? Because this has to do with smelling. It doesn't have to do with wiggling your nose. This is a sensory nerve, so so sensory olfactory. So that's the first one. Okay. As you move into Dunder Mifflin, and you know, there's this really strong connection, obviously, between Jim and Pam. We have Jim, okay? Jim is wearing Dwight's glasses, so we're thinking eyes, we're thinking optics. You can think of him either looking towards Dwight, or you can see him, you know, obviously looking towards Pam, which he does a lot in the show. So this is the optic nerve, all right? And it's sensory as well, again, because this is about looking. It's not about moving his eyes. And obviously this has to do with vision, okay? We're going to move on to the third one here. Okay, so what I like to picture is not Dwight being at his desk, but Dwight having the CPR mannequin from the CPR episode right here in front of Michael's office, okay? And specifically with this mannequin, Dwight has noticed the eyes of the mannequin, and they're doing two things. One thing is that they're looking in different directions, all right? So either the face that he cut off or the face of the mannequin, and the pupils are dilated, okay? The other thing I like to think of is he's starting the motor of a chainsaw to either, you know, cut the head off or, you know, cut through or cut the face off or whatever. So the idea here is we're working with the eyes, all right? This is oculo. And then because he started a motor, the title of this is oculomotor, okay? And there's two very specific things that Dwight noticed about this mannequin is that the eyes were in different directions. So the oculomotor nerve has to do with coordinated eye movement, and then it has to do with pupil diameter as well, okay? So, I mean, you'll notice here that we're not necessarily dealing with like the letters O, but what you'll realize is you don't need that, because once you start to picture, hey, I'm at Pam's desk, you're going to picture an old factory. You're going to picture cookies. You're going to picture Pam. And you will find that sitting in your brain next to this location is the word olfactory. It's pretty unbelievable, but I promise you it's true, and that's how it works. These words will just start coming to you. All right, and we'll talk through, after I go through the 12, how you can practice this. Okay, so we started at reception. We went to Jim. We have this situation going on with Dwight, and because of the door that he's right in front of, whose attention is he going to get? He's going to get Michael's attention. So Michael, who was sitting at his desk, he knocks over his Dundee trophy, and he's looking through his window. And where is he looking? Because he's looking downward towards this mannequin. All right. So the other thing that I like to think of too is that he is clearing a space on his window. Let's say his window was foggy, so he's clearing a space on his window. And the reason that I mention that is because he's knocking over this trophy, so the word tro, and then he's clearing the window, which is clear. So troclear is the name of this nerve. And it's really simple. It's a motor nerve. All it has to do is the downward movement of the eyes, okay? Oops. All right, the downward movement of the eyes. Moved that slightly. Move that back there. Okay. So that's the first 4. So now we're going over to 5. And 5 is the trigeminal nerve, okay? This is a mixed nerve, so it involves sensory as well as motor, okay? And there's three parts of this. There's V1, V2, V3, which I believe the V is just 5, the Roman numeral 5. So 5-1, 5-2, 5-3. So this made sense to me to tie in the 3-person sales department. I mean, Jim and Dwight are in sales also, but this triplet of desks here fits perfectly. So kind of our closest seat here is going to be Phyllis. What's going on with Phyllis? I picture her kind of reacting to this scene of Dwight. She's putting her hand over her forehead, and she was putting in some eye drops, okay? Why eye drops? Because this nerve is called the ophthalmic, okay? And why is she putting her hand over her head? Because this innervates the sense of the forehead. So if you touch your forehead with your finger, that is the ophthalmic portion of the trigeminal nerve that you're working with, okay? Moving on to V2 of trigeminal, we're talking about Andy. Andy also reacting to this scene by putting his hands on his cheeks. And you can also think of, he had all those nicknames in college. One of those was Mad Max. So you'll either know the anatomical term for the cheeks, which are the maxillae or the maxilla, which is technically the bone of your like your upper jaw into your cheek area. Okay, so if you touch your cheeks, you are dealing with this nerve here. So maxillary is V2. The third one, we think of Stanley the Manly, man, because this is mandibular. And Stanley really can't be bothered with all the nonsense that's going on. He's focused on chewing his pretzel, okay? And mandibular has to do with chewing. This is a mixed nerve, so it has to do with sensory as well as motor. That motor part is what makes the entire trigeminal nerve mixed because of this third part. B stands for both, okay? So that's V1, V2, and V3 of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, moving on to 6, we're going to cross over the office here and go and see Meredith, who is sitting here, okay? She is showing her abs like she does in that music intro with that song, and she has nobody written across it, but she's showing her abdomen. So this is the abducens. All right, this is a motor, and I picture her just kind of side-eyeing the situation over here, and this one's really easy. It's comparable to cranial nerve 4, the trochlear, because it's a motor eye nerve, but this one is lateral movement instead of downward movement. So pretty easy to wrap your head around. 7 is a mixed nerve called facial. I picture Creed making this kind of shocked face, which I've covered up a little bit to show he's putting a pill on his tongue as well. So the idea here is this is a mixed nerve. The motor portion of this is the facial movement, the actual movement of your face to make a shocked face. And the sensory version of this is the 2/3 anterior portion of your tongue, which is exactly where you would put a pill. Okay. All right. Now, I always think of this connection between like Ryan and Creed, of Creed like wanting to be a young, cool, hip guy like Ryan, like when he dyes his hair black. So he's going to kind of look over towards Ryan, who's, came out from the annex. He's kind of standing in this area. And Ryan is riding on a Vespa. He's wearing a vest. That makes me think of vestibulo. And then he's also listening to music, through his ears, the cochlea, which has to do with hearing and balance. So, once you get Vespa or vest, you will easily pick up vestibulo-cochlear, okay? And I also picture him not only listening to music, which is the hearing portion of this, but trying to balance on this Vespa. The other thing you can do as a check and balance is that he's doing a figure 8, okay? So we've reached the 8th cranial nerve. That way you don't have to go through like 1 through 8. If somebody says, well, what's the 7th cranial nerve? You kind of have to start 1 through 7, which you would have to do with any mnemonic anyway. But you'll start to pick up these numbers and connect them with their character, with this location, and more importantly, with the name of the cranial nerve and its function, okay? So because this one has to do with senses, both balance and hearing, this is a sensory nerve, so vestibulocochlear. Okay, now we are going to go over to our accounting department where we have a nice little triplet here. So we're going to start with kind of the closest to reception, which is going to be Angela. Perfectly, this is ocular nerve 9, which, not ocular nerve, cranial nerve 9, which fits the 9 lives of a cat. So this is her cat Bandit here. We are going to picture Angela putting on lip gloss, okay, and we are going to picture the dander from her cat kind of affecting the back of her throat, kind of making the back of her throat itch a little bit, like you do when you have like an allergic reaction. So that's where we're getting glossopharyngeal. All right, so once you get the lip gloss, that just starts with gloss, and then you think about her throat being affected, glossopharyngeal. This is a mixed nerve, similar to what Creed had going on with the sensory of the anterior 2/3 of his tongue. We are now working with the rear 1/3 of the tongue, so closer to the pharynx, to the throat, which we're involved with here. And then I think it's, I don't necessarily remember the motor part of this, but you just have to know it has to do with the throat and the tongue, and that this is a mixed nerve, okay? All right, 10, we're going to go right across the partition here over to Kevin. And, this is him at casino night with his poker chips. So Vegas, I love how when you're making mnemonics, memory palaces like this, and things like 9 lives, like Vegas, how they line up so perfectly with the character, because you will forever think of Kevin Malone and the Vegas nerve now that you've kind of made these connections. It's pretty cool. And I kind of think of like, I don't know, 10 out of 10 would be something you would want to get at a casino at Vegas. All right, the Vegas nerve is the one that goes like kind of pretty far through the body into like the abdomen area. But you like to think if you're sitting at a poker table, your heart rate is up, your blood pressure is up. So this has to do with heart rate and blood pressure. It has to do with peristalsis, which is that kind of autonomic function of swallowing and food moving through your digestive tract. And it also has to do with some senses in the abdominopelvic cavity as well. Okay. All right, 11, we're going, of course, to our third accountant, to Oscar. This is the spinal accessory cranial nerve. This is a motor nerve that has to do with swallowing. So I think of Oscar here chugging a bottle of his favorite wine. And, he's pretty good on hygiene, so he's cleaning his hair with Head and Shoulders. So what does this have to do with? Moving the head and shoulders and with swallowing. So that's a motor nerve. All right, 12, the final cranial nerve is the hypoglossal. Finally, Toby comes out from the annex and he's going to kind of give a speech to just the madness of the office of what's going on out here, telling them all of this is inappropriate. Everybody needs to get back to work. What he realized is that he just went to Costa Rica and got a tongue piercing, and it's really bothering him underneath. So hypo, which is low or below his tongue, and then you'll remember that glossal is the term for like the tongue or like speech or like swallowing. So this is the hypoglossal. It's a motor, so it's him speaking, it's him moving his mouth, and this has to do with speaking and swallowing. You could think because he's having this inflammation of his tongue, he's actually having trouble speaking and swallowing, and he's not able to deliver this speech. All right, so that is the 12 cranial nerves of Dunder Mifflin. Now, how you can put this into practice is immediately after hearing this for the first time, grab a pen and paper or try to free recall this by yourself. See what you can remember. You'll be surprised after just hearing this once that you could probably remember like 50% of this. There's going to be a lot of holes here and there, but you'll be shocked at how much you can remember by simply navigating yourself through Dunder Mifflin and all of these little scenes and scenarios that we went into. Okay? And the idea is after you establish this, you want to repeat it immediately after and do your best. Even if it's 50%, even if you remember 10% of this, that's fine. Then you can move on to repeating it the next day, the next week, and the next month. Obviously, if you have a test coming up, the next month isn't really going to help, but that's going to help encode this into long-term memory. It's going to help you remember this during your clinical practice, during when, if you're taking the MCAT, if you need to do this, this is really going to help. And then, you take the MCAT and then you need this again in med school or you need this in PA school. You're going to remember this a lot more easily than just a mnemonic because the functions of all of this are built right in. And this is kind of the idea of, this is how I free recalled this. So I wrote all of this out and, you'll notice none of the Dunder Mifflin stuff is in there. You use all of that kind of as scaffolding. And what you'll realize is these crazy ideas with the old factory, with the cookies, with the chainsaw, with the eye drops, that scaffolding will fade away over time. And you will just be able to think about Phyllis or her desk or reception, and you will remember olfactory and that it's sensory and that it's smell. And you will think about Jim, and you will think about optic and sensory and vision. You will think about Meredith, and you will think about abducens. So it's pretty amazing. It's definitely worth a try. The other thing that you can do, there is a mnemonic that is, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. And that is a quick way to double check whether you have the sensory and the motor correct. So the S's obviously are sensory, M is motor, and the B is both. You can also remember 5, 7, 9, and 10, which is the trigeminal sales team, Creed, which is facial, Angela, 9 lives, glossopharyngeal, and Kevin, Vegas. See, you're already remembering that Kevin is Vegas and that he's the 10th. Angela, you're thinking 9 lives. Sal's team, you're thinking trigeminal, which is the 5th. So it's already starting to come together, hopefully. But recalling this while thinking about that memory palace is what's really going to cement this into your long-term memory. So there you go, and I hope this helps.